Welcome back, everybody. This is our Chapter 13 review. Remember, Chapter 13 dealt with infection and disease. So these are some basics that are in the chapter. Remember, you're not going to learn everything you need to know from the review. This is just refreshing your memory on some of the more important aspects that topics that we learned about in this chapter. So infection versus pathology versus disease versus infectious disease. So an infection is whenever we have a microorganism that has established itself in the tissues and is growing and multiplying there, where it wouldn't have been previously, or wouldn't have at least been in those numbers, right? So pathology is referring to basically the development of symptoms associated with that, so or signs, but unpleasant changes in the living situation of the organism that's being infected. So that's pathology. So observable, effects of the infection. So then we have usually due to damage, right? Then we have the disease itself. So a disease is any deviation from your health, normal health. So any deviation from what you consider to be typical health. And then we have the infectious disease. So remember, disease doesn't always be caused by a pathogen. Disease can be caused by a lot of things like genetic defects. It can be caused by cancer and all sorts of things like that. So it's not always going to be due to an infection. Infectious disease is disease that is caused by an infection, which we've already talked about. So all right, so next we have the resident biota. Remember that in the humans, the whole combination of the human plus the microbiome that inhabits us, that is going to be called the holobiont. Sorry, I'll write it for you. Right up here. This is probably underneath my thing, isn't it, for you guys? I don't know. I'll just write it over here then. That is the microbiome plus the human themselves. That's what I'm trying to say. So, all right. So human microbiome consists of the four things: the bacteria, the viruses, the fungi, the protozoa. Fungi like yeast. Yeast is fungi. Do not forget that. So that's normal to have yeast as part of your microbiome. Also, as far as the eukaryotes go, I mean, helminths should not be part of it. So that's just going to be the protozoa, and there's going to be very few of them. Anyways, it might be amoebas like entamoeba that might be involved in like your gut or something like that, but that's about it. So then we have the concept of microbial antagonism, essentially our gut biota, and that is going to be not always your gut biota. It could be any of your biota, but microbial antagonism, what it's talking about is whenever microbes that are normal parts of your body are essentially providing protection for you from invasive microbes. So whether they're taking up the stadium seats, right? So they are unlikely to move once they've established themselves in an area. And some of them do produce certain toxins or other things that prevent or dissuade potential pathogens from causing infection. All right, so gut biota has a huge effect on your overall health. It might even be related to things like your mental well-being and your susceptibility to certain infections, which is very interesting. How do you get your biota? You get your biota, typically you start acquiring it in the womb, so in utero, and then you'll be exposed to more when you're born, whether that is cesarean or vaginal. And then those might become part of your normal biome. Drinking breast milk has quite a few bacteria involved there that can help break down sugars that you normally wouldn't be able to. So those will become part of your normal microbiome. And you can replace that with certain formulas. And then so on and so forth. Everything that you encounter from there on out can just be adding on to the variety of your normal biome of your body. So that's pretty interesting stuff. Colonized, right, we already said that, colonized starting in the womb. And that continues with your diet as you go on throughout your life, especially when talking about your gut health. So talking about becoming infected, are typical steps involved in this. We have portal of entry, you have to get in somehow. Attaching, you have to stick somehow and stay in that area to cause the infection. Surviving the host defense somehow so you don't get killed too easily. Causing disease is usually not a goal of the organism, but it depends on the infection and what's going on. It's usually due to the inflammatory response from the immune system. And then we have exiting the host after we've been causing disease. It's time to move on and go to another host so that we can populate the whole world. We're taking over the world as pathogens. Always think of them as that way. So cool. Our portal of entry can be exogenous or endogenous microorganisms as well. So that could include endogenous organisms, are organisms that are part of your normal biome, but maybe there's a shift or they've gotten transported from one area into another area where they don't belong, such as the E. coli getting shifted into the urinary tract, causing the urinary tract infection. E. coli doesn't belong in the urinary tract, so causes infection, not a good deal. That's the idea with endogenous. It came from your own body. Exogenous is coming from outside the body, however it got in there. There's a lot of different ways that it could get in there potentially. So, and it'd be, just be aware of that concept and how that could happen. Right. So surviving the host defenses, you want to have what are called anti-phagocytic factors. If you can, those are going to be the most helpful thing for evading the host. Typically because the phagocytes, the white blood cells that go around eating things up, including damaged tissue, like if you just cut yourself or, stub your toe or whatever it is, there's some damage, they're going to go around and eat up all like the bad damaged cells and whatever. And so that's the phagocytes. They also eat up anything foreign, so anything around them that shouldn't be there, like pathogens and invasive microbes. So that's good. So they're going to be doing that. A lot of these microbes have developed ways to evade that, so to speak. So that includes making it harder for the phagocyte to eat it, or even producing some sort of toxin that kills the phagocyte, or even liking to be in the phagocyte. That's where we have tuberculosis that likes to live in the alveolar macrophages. That's the word, and actually flourishes in there and prefers it. So those would be anti-phagocytic factors, anything that allows it to evade what the phagocytes would typically be doing. Now we're going to be causing disease. Now, did we talk about adhesion? I'm sorry, let's step it back a little bit. I jumped just right ahead to host defenses. So portal of entry, could have come from outside, could have come from inside. Attachment and adhesion. So this could literally be just from something like a capsule or something sticky like that, or it could be due to fimbriae, which are for attachment in bacteria, or it could even be due to glycoprotein interactions between the spikes of the virus and the normal proteins on the outside of a host cell. And that can actually help determine how specific the virus has to be in order to cause infection. What I'm saying is, can they infect all of these different cell types, or does it have to be this cell type and this kind of organism? Does it have to be super specific? So that's all determined by that interaction, the spike on the virus and the host proteins. They're called glycoproteins on both of those. So viral glycoproteins or host glycoproteins, sugar plus protein. Okay, so that was the adhesion. So we got through that. Okay, sorry about that. Then the anti-phagocytic factors to protect from getting eaten all up. Sorry. Then literally moving on to causing disease. Virulence factors are anything that will establish pathogenicity, so cause bad effects, cause the disease, the presentation of the disease, and the establishment of that organism in the infection, okay? That could be, an example would be an exotoxin, something that the organism secretes that is toxic or causes death or damage to the tissue, or endotoxin, which is not secreted, it is just part of the outer membrane of gram-negative cells. Next, the patterns of infection. We went through each of these, and I'm not going to go into detail with them here, but we had localized, systemic, and focal. We had mixed infections with a lot of organisms involved. We had primary versus secondary infections. So the initial infection plus the thing that piggybacked potentially onto The original infections, decreasing your immune response or something like that, that's a secondary. And then acute, short-lived, chronic, or long-term. Then we had signs versus symptoms. Signs are measurable effects caused in the patient, whereas symptoms are going to be like reported. So sign might be a fever and a symptom might be nausea. You can't actually measure how nauseous somebody is. And then we talk about the idea of syndromes, which is like we have a set of signs and symptoms associated with something, an illness, but it could be caused by any number of things like meningitis. Okay. Then we talked about with regards to causing disease and you being sick with this pathogen, development of inflammation and the importance kind of the inflammatory response and influx of fluid, influx of cells into the area to help fight the infection. And that'd be your first responder as far as what happens whenever you do encounter a pathogen. Then we have the difference between leukocytosis or penia. Leukocytosis is increased white cell count. Leukopenia, that would be a decreased white cell count. And those can be indicators of disease. Both of them can. Then we have septicemia. This is flourishing or growth of microbes in the bloodstream. And then bacteremia, remember that's going to be any bacteria in the blood at all that aren't necessarily flourishing. They shouldn't be there at all. And then viremia is viruses in the blood, whether they're flourishing or not. They shouldn't be there. Asymptomatic and subclinical infections, we already know this is mostly going to have to deal with low or no exhibiting of symptoms or signs. Usually there's going to be at least one sign, but sometimes there's not. So that could be associated with, potentially being contagious to other people. All right, so we have our causing of disease. Next, we want to get out of the host so we can go on to the next host and take over the world. And so how will we do that? Well, we talked about all the different portals of entry. We talked about sneezing. We talked about the direct transmission. We talked about indirect transmission. We talked about fomites. We talked about oral fecal transmission and all of this sort of stuff. We have long-term infections. That's a thing. Usually, a lot of times that's going to be associated with latency, not always, but sometimes it's just the bacteria or something just hiding out and just biding its time, like what you get with tuberculosis. But sometimes it can be due to latency. So you get the provirus actually incorporating itself into your genome, and you wouldn't see it coming out until it thought the time was right, like what we have with the chickenpox and shingles. So then we have long-term effects that last from the disease, even if you did clear it out. That would be like paralysis from polio, for example. That's going to be there even if you're not sick with the polio anymore. All right, our next thing are 4 phases of the course of an infection. First, you have the incubation period where you don't have presence of very much of that microbe, just growing and getting ready. This is going to be waiting on the immune response as well of the host. So you're going to see very much as far as the pathogenicity of the disease. Next, we have the prodromal period. This is going to be where we see our first symptoms. Next is in the invasive period. This is essentially just going to be, everything growing out of control and getting the worst of the symptoms. And then we have the convalescence where everything's going to be getting dying out, essentially. You're clearing up the infection typically. We talked about the difference between reservoirs and sources. Reservoirs are places in nature, essentially, where the microbe exists naturally, other than where it's causing terrible disease. And that the source is where if you got sick, the source is what you got sick from. So specific to the infection, what caused that infection? That's the source. And we have carriers, people that can, transmit that disease to other people. They could be symptomatic or non-symptomatic, or there could be convalescent or all sorts of things, but still be passing on the disease. And then zoonosis is a disease that is found in animals typically and can be transported to people, but that's typically a dead-end host. People are dead-end hosts. All right, remember we can have transmission via biological or mechanical vectors. So biological, they're actually getting infected or involved in the pathogenic process somehow. The mechanical vectors are literally mechanically moving the disease. So they walk through poop and then come and touch your sample, your food, and then get that contaminated with that poop while it's doing that. And now you can get sick from eating that food. So that would include something like flies or cockroaches. Cool. Communicable versus contagious versus non-communicable. Communicable can be transferred from person to person. Contagious, highly communicable. Non-communicable can't be transferred from person to person. If you get malaria and you have malaria, you aren't going to pass it person to person, right? That's going to be mosquitoes need to be doing that. All right. Horizontal is just from person to person in the normal population. Vertical is going to be from the parent to the child actively, like in the womb or during conception or something like that. Vehicles, fomites. So a vehicle is anything that's going to allow us to transmit a disease from one place to another without it going directly. So lick the pen, give it to you, you grab the pen where I licked it, you get COVID later on from that. That is a vehicle. It's also known as a fomite. That fomite is something inanimate that is going to allow us to transport that disease from one place to the next and isn't actually a source of the disease continuously. Cool. Oral fecal route, we talked about that. You can get illness from water and soil as well. Like if we talked about anthrax, if we talk about tetanus, that's another example. We can also get it from the air via droplet nuclei and aerosols. And we talked about Koch's postulates. That was we used a series of steps in order to prove the causative agent of something. So you have a sick person, you take a sample from them, you isolate whatever it is you think it is that's causing sickness, put it into a healthy being, and then if they have the same symptoms and you're able to isolate that same thing out again a second time, then that is the causative agent of the illness. And that was chapter 13. And thank you guys for joining me. I will talk to you guys on the next one.